Minnesota is on the edge. On your screens now, you can see this shocking visual from cities, churches in Minneapolis this morning itself, from an SBS church where an anti-ICE mob stormed the service and disrupted their worship, alleging that one of the lead pastors of the church is an ICE agent. What else is left to disrupt? Where else can the agents barge in unannounced? Let's take a look at another instance now. With this visual on your screen, you can see in which there is an elderly man who is being marched out of his house in this freezing weather while it is snowing by ICE officers. He is being dragged out of his house in 5-degree weather in St. Paul in Minnesota in his underwear and slippers. This is clear injustice that has been going on. What began as a massive federal immigration crackdown has now spiraled into days of protests, court intervention and a political standoff between the Trump administration and state authorities. What's happening in Minnesota exactly? What can we expect now? What are the updates? Well, let's take a closer look. You're watching another episode of Deep Dive. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. We're going to take a breakdown of the ongoings for you in Minnesota. Before we go further, let's orient our viewers geographically and demographically. Minnesota is a U.S. state located in the north-central part of the country, bordering Canada to the north and the Great Lakes region to the east. In the United States of America, it's home to the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the state's largest urban area. As of the most recent U.S. Census estimates, Minnesota's population is about 5.8 million people, roughly the same size as countries like Qatar or Belize. The Twin Cities metro area alone accounts for over half of that population. This relatively moderate population size helps explain why this immigration crackdown and the resulting protests have drawn national and even international attention, because the scale of enforcement in Minnesota is unusual for a non-border state. Thousands of immigration enforcement officers have been deployed across Minneapolis and surrounding areas in what the federal government calls its largest immigration operation ever. Raids in residential neighborhoods, workplaces and near schools have left communities shaken and angry. Tensions exploded after a fatal shooting involving a federal immigration officer, triggering widespread protests across the city. Demonstrators have taken to the streets demanding accountability and an end to what they call heavy-handed federal tactics. As protests intensified, a federal judge stepped in, ordering restrictions on how immigration agents deal with peaceful protesters and observers. But even that has not cooled the situation, because now the crisis in Minnesota has moved beyond immigration enforcement. The White House has openly floated the possibility of invoking one of the most powerful and controversial laws in American history, a law that allows the U.S. military to be deployed on American streets. It's called the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a 218-year-old U.S. law passed in 1807 that gives the president extraordinary powers during times of domestic unrest. It allows the president to deploy active duty U.S. military forces or take control of a state's National Guard inside the U.S. if federal law cannot be enforced or if civil order has broken down. Under normal circumstances, U.S. law strictly prohibits the military from policing civilians. That restriction exists under the Posse Comitatus Act. But the Insurrection Act is a rare exception, one that temporarily overrides those limits, allowing soldiers to perform law enforcement roles on American streets. That's why the Insurrection Act is often described as a last resort power designed for moments when state authority collapses or when the federal government believes constitutional order itself is under threat. The Insurrection Act is not a law that's used lightly. In fact, it has not been formally invoked in more than 3 decades. The last time a U.S. president used the Insurrection Act was in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots. It was invoked by President George H.W. Bush after days of widespread violence erupted in Los Angeles following the acquittal of police officers involved in the beating of Rodney King. Local and state authorities were overwhelmed, buildings were burning, dozens were killed, and the situation spiraled out of control. At the request of California's governor, President Bush deployed federal troops and National Guard units under the Insurrection Act to restore order. But for sustained large-scale violence where civilian law enforcement had collapsed across more than 2 centuries of American history, the Insurrection Act has been invoked sparingly. Presidents have turned to it during the Civil War, during violent resistance to civil rights enforcement in the 1950s and 60s, and once again in 1992. Each time it was framed as a response to an extraordinary breakdown of order, because when a 218-year-old emergency law meant for moments of collapse enters today's political playbook, it's not just Minnesota at stake, it's the limits of power in American democracy itself. Joining us live is Andrew Latham, Professor of International Relations. What do you make, Andrew, of this situation in Minnesota, and how is it being interpreted there in the US where you are?
Actually, in St. Paul, one of the Twin Cities, and I can tell you that it's being received by everybody I know very poorly. There's a great deal of resistance to this surge in ICE operations. There's a great deal of opposition to the way in which the ICE officers are conducting themselves. There's really a grassroots movement to end this. And you're quite right to point out that the stakes are quite high. This is, when it comes to the Insurrection Act, the bar right now is set very high. And President Trump is trying to lower it considerably. If he does that and he gets away with it, then that sets a precedent going forward. Right now, it needs to be said that the troops of the 11th Airborne are stationed in Alaska, and they're equipped and trained to deal with cold weather. And believe me, it's very cold here today. They're being prepared to deploy. They haven't yet been deployed. The act hasn't yet been invoked, but the tensions on the ground are palpable. I've been living in this state now for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it before.
Absolutely. And, also, of course, is this expected to continue there? Because there is this face-off, there is a determined US administration, and there are the court standoffs as well, which continue.
Well, there's multiple sort of vectors of conflict here. There's the federal government versus the state government. The federal government cannot commandeer the state government to enforce federal laws, especially with respect to immigration. But the state government can't impede the federal government from enforcing those laws. So that's one. The other one, of course, involves the courts and whether this is where the bar will be set with respect to the Insurrection Act, if it is in fact invoked. And then, of course, there's the people versus the federal government, which is another vector of tension and conflict. There's unprecedented, really, popular resistance to this in the streets of the Twin Cities. So we put all of those moving parts in play, and it remains to be seen how this will work out. Right now, nobody seems interested in backing down. The federal government under President Trump, no. Minneapolis Mayor Fry and the governor of the state of Minnesota, Tim Walz, they're not backing down, and the people are certainly not backing down. So it remains to be seen, I suppose, who breaks first and what role the courts will play in determining the winners and the losers, because that's the way I think it's being framed, the winners and losers in all of this.
Yes. Also, Professor Latham, finally, before we let you go on the Insurrection Act, how likely is it that it will be invoked there? And if it is, what will this mean? Because it is used few times and sparingly in the US. You know the history of this act very well as well.
Yes, well, it will look less like the Civil War back in the 19th century and more like Los Angeles in 1992. The federal troops, if they are deployed, will be deployed to protect ICE officers as they go about what the feds are calling their lawful duties and their responsibilities. And if the resistance is such, it's violent and there's a great deal of disorder, then the troops can be used to manage that as well. Assuming, of course, that the state authorities don't step in or unable or unwilling to step in and maintain law and order. So that's what we're likely to see. It's not, as I said, not going to look like the Civil War in 1861. It's going to look more like Los Angeles in 1992. Still, though, unprecedented. I don't believe that since the Civil War, the troops have ever been deployed in the streets like that in the state of Minnesota. The National Guard, which is a state militia, they've been deployed, but not the federal standing military. They haven't been deployed before. So again, sets a precedent, lowers the bar, raises the temperature, and there's even some speculation that the goal here is to bait the protesters into overreacting and therefore justifying further action down the road. It's an unfolding story. It's not going to be over today or tomorrow. Stay tuned.
Appreciate you joining us, Andrew Latham, with your perspective on this segment.